Welcome, everyone. I would like to start by particularly thanking Claudio Vogt for inviting us, inviting independent, emerging, and somehow alternative voices into a global art event like this one. I think is really important, and I hope that this conversation will somehow fill in a small gap in the conversations. In today's talk, there's an interesting contradiction. We will be talking about the Middle East, about art practices from the greater Middle East that are not directly dealing with the region and its complex political context. I will be referring to the expression greater Middle East or the region by commodity to make myself clear. But where are the borders of the Middle East? How can we refer to it as one region talking about artistic practice? It seems to me that there is a common misuse of this term. We rarely talk about European art as a whole, for instance. All of us have heard at least once that major political crises and wars shaped the development of artistic practices in the Middle East. This is a statement I want to question. There were many shows grouping artists from the Middle East, placing them into preconceived frameworks of identity and locality. These exhibitions are perceived as defining the region's cultural production, highlighting a specific type of practices at the expenses of diversity. In other words, I will be closely looking at artists and art practices for their way of dealing with the material, looking at also poetic visual language beyond the geographical belonging, or let's say the places where the artists come from or where they work from. Non-narrative in this talk will be defined as non-narrative on the geopolitical context and not non-narrative per se. Please join me welcoming my guests, Umer gallerist of Grey Noise, Dubai, Gregory Buchakjian, Pascal, Hachem, and Basim, Magdy. As you will see, there will be a PowerPoint that will start now, and that will be scrolling at least 6 times during this talk. We won't be stopping at specific images, but somehow we found very frustrating to talk about an art practice by referring to 2 specific artists only. So we kind of curated this slideshow with artists that are bringing interesting insight to this conversation. I'm going to start with Gregory Buchakjian. Gregory, you are an artist, but you're also a very prolific art historian. I met you a few years ago at the Lebanese Academy of Fine Arts, where you teach at the moment, and you wrote a book called A War and Other Impossible Impossibilities. Before talking about your research and your book, can you please mention this artwork of Urayb Toukan that you once told me about? She was kind of setting the borders of the Middle East in a very interesting way.
Well, this work is an installation called The Newer Middle East. It's a map that with the border of the countries that may be completely dismantled. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. And Toukan did this intervention after the war in Iraq, and after there was a plan done by a US officer to reshape the Middle East. And there were new countries that should exist, a new Phoenicia, a Shia Arab state, a Sunni sacred state, etc., etc. And I find this work by Toukan extremely interesting when we see how the region has evolved during the past 10 years, including the past couple of weeks with what is happening in Iraq.
And in your research, I was very interested in the way you were linking modern practices to the contemporary artist practice in the region. Can you tell us about your research and what you included in this book?
Well, this book, War and Other Impossible Possibilities, was the project started in 2010. So it started before the so-called Arab Spring or Arab revolutions or whatever. It started at a time the art market was booming in the Middle East, And this art market was mainly dominated by practices that were very political, narrative, dealing with September 11, the war in Iraq, Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, Lebanese civil war, etc. So this book is based on a collection of artworks that were mainly related to this kind of subjects. And the book tries to analyze how and why practices of Arab artists are so deeply anchored into this political and historical trauma.
So is it a reading of the region? I mean, the political situation in the region through the artworks of this collection?
I didn't hear it.
Is it a reading of the political situation of the region through the artworks and vice versa?
More history. Actually, I went back till the 19th century to try to analyze how this region has evolved and how war has been a dominant. Just the list of wars in my book is more than one page, the list of the wars. So there are many wars that are completely forgotten. War is a factor that is dominant in the Middle East. There have never been a single period, a single day in this region without war somewhere. So now, not all countries have been involved into war, but the region is in a state of war for 70 years.
And to what extent these wars shaped artistic practices, according to you, and where do you fit the artist practices that we will be talking about today in their?
Actually, as I was quite surprised when you invite me to this talk, because when you told me you wanted us to talk about non-narrative practices, and I am someone who is deeply into narrative as an art historian and as an artist, so I didn't see the point. And then when we discussed, there is something very interesting in the history of the Arab world, is that in the years, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you have the period that was the period of modernity, a period with experiments, with abstraction, with artists who have been using many materials. I think about Michel Basbous, who is one of the most prolific or most famous Lebanese sculptor of this period. And even some, I have discovered a guy, an Armenian guy, Nishan Kazazian, who did in the late 60s practices that are in the Fluxus continuation. And these practices are totally in the history of international modernity. And then in the 1990s, you have something completely different, which is what have been called the contemporary art practices, with curators such as Catherine David and artists like, well, I'm not going to cite because they are extremely known, that are based on this very tormented history. And there is a gap, there is a rupture between the modern and what was the contemporary in the 1990s and 2000s. And what may be happening now, I'm not going to say a reconciliation, but today we are seeing new artists, young artists who are in the late 20s or early 30s, who are again working in a more universal language. And we are seeing in the same time tremendous interest towards the modern periods. The artists like Basbous, Salwa Dashir, Shafi Aboud, Yvette Ashar, Saliba Douaihi, who have been the subject of publications, retrospective exhibitions, etc. Salwa Dashir was at the Tate 2 years ago. It was some achievement. So it's interesting to see today that there is a new evolution, and the question is, where are we going? Nobody can answer, but it's certainly a very interesting time we are living in the art scene of our region.
I mean, In Beirut, the city where we both come from, there is a very important aesthetics in regard to the historiography of the war, and I would say a practice of narratology. And it's really interesting to see how your research is kind of bridging this modernist with the contemporary practices. We will maybe ask Pascal, who is based in Lebanon, what he thinks about that. But let me introduce Pascal first. Pascal, you are a visual artist, and you live and work in Beirut, and you're represented by galleries in Europe. Your installations always seem to emerge from a specific context, from the context of Lebanon, let's say. But the final outcome seems to be a universal one. So you stage mundane objects, and you take them you take them away from their everyday life. Can you tell us a little bit about your practice and about the process of making of your work?
Somehow I can start by mentioning one project. I did it in Amman with Rael Neiman. The main subject was about no condition is permanent, and somehow it can summarize the whole situation in my everyday life. So we have a lot of surprises, a lot of things that might happen during my work or during my basic routine. So this is why I created some sort of relationship with these conditions by simply reacting on the spot while building or while preparing any project. So somehow the project became like a tool to say things because it's like I'm trying always to share my everyday life in Beirut, and by simply reacting and showing all these kind of conditions that we face. So somehow I can say that Beirut is part of my practice, and Beirut is conditioning my everyday life. Regarding the non-narrative aspects, since I'm using like the visual element in my work, so I believe that there is no verbal translation. So why I have to create another border for me or for other people? So simply by opening or by taking off all these coding system that only the people from the region can read it. So why not opening it to make it more for everyone, accessible for everyone? So suddenly, by taking some sort of few elements, the work can be accessible for everyone. And I still believe that even if I'm coming from different contexts, we have a lot of issue, and we are sharing sometimes same issues. So, and I let the work speak on all these little details.
The works are very formalistically driven, I would say. I visited your studio, and you have a studio-based practice. You experiment with material, you have a very big machinery, and you work a lot with this idea of machinery and tools. Your background in industrial design, in interior design, you have a background in interior design. How did it influence your work?
Actually, I have both industrial design and interior design. So for sure I have a notion of space, but somehow it's, for me, I have this kind of practice where while sketching my ideas, I can easily understand that how far I can go in the production. So, and this helped me to understand that sometimes I would like to be very light in my production. So sometimes I use very simple elements to introduce the work, and sometimes very complex work.
There is an image that seems frozen in the PowerPoint. Maybe you would like to comment on it. Can we go back one image before? This is a fuel gun, a power gun that you showed at Federica Schiavo Gallery in Italy last year. It's a very intriguing work. There is a word, so obviously there is a narrative part, I would say, in it. Can you tell us something about it?
Actually, the main subject of this show was about that everyone wants always more and more. And it speaks a little bit about the energy of and all the resources of our planet and our human bodies. And this combination between the fuel gun and the writing summarize a little bit the relationship between the fuel as energy and the total possession as a branding too. So somehow.
Thank you. We will get back to you in a second. Basim, you are a visual artist and you live between Cairo and Basel. I think you moved to Basel 7 years ago. Your work is present in international and global art institutions and platforms, and your work conveys narratives that have no beginning and no end somehow. You manipulate materials like film, cameras, and colors, and you sometimes also create your own tools, like the kaleidoscope I saw in your studio yesterday. You published a text in 2003 in Nafas Art magazine titled "Walk Like an Egyptian," in which you state the following, and I will quote you. Based on the Western media's stereotypical views of the social, cultural, and political situation in Egypt, most Western curators find themselves fascinated only by Egyptian artwork that deals specifically with socio-political issues, dismissing diverse aesthetics, interests as ones that do not relate to any immediate local reality. Following these assumptions, an obvious pattern can be traced regarding the context in which contemporary Egyptian artist work has recently been presented in major international shows. In the majority of these, artists interested in the sociopolitics of the local have been selected largely on the basis of their respective geographical background, example, Egyptian, Arab, African, etc., bearing in mind the cultural, ethnic, and religious expectation that background is associated with. As a result of this situation, Egyptian artists who work within different contexts, based on widely diverse individual interests, find the current situation quite frustrating. The stereotyping of socio-political art as the preeminent representation of contemporary Egyptian art leaves them wedged in between institutional accusations of being influenced by Western trends on one hand and Western accusations of neglecting their local identity issues. This is an excerpt of a text in 2003. You say it all. Can you comment on it 10 years later? Has anything changed somehow?
Well, it's been 10 years, so a lot has changed, obviously. I think this was a very different moment. It was 2 years after September 11th. There was an interest in this particular region of the world. Suddenly, I believe there was more money to do shows about this because governments, big museums, and cities were interested in introducing a different vision about this place to their public. And at the same time, it was a premature moment for both those curators and for the artists I'm going to talk about Egypt in particular. Because at that point, those curators were landing in Egypt with only preconceived ideas. They didn't really know much about what was happening there. They didn't know, they were not familiar with this art scene. At the same time, there were artists who were working for previous years before that, and their work wasn't really presented outside the context of Egypt. It wasn't presented internationally. And suddenly there was all those opportunities to show your work internationally, except it comes with this particular limitation that it will be presented in this context of where you come from. Of course, I talk about how there was always preconceived ideas and the understanding of the person who's coming to the region of what the region is about, which is, I would claim, is always wrong.
And you clearly stood against it by refusing many invitations of curators.
Well, I have been refusing to show in shows that are basically about where I come from since then. But part of that is also that I believe, and as I said, a lot has changed, and I've had so many discussions with people about this, so and I understand the contradiction of me speaking at a panel discussion that has a title like this. But part of the things that changed is that I realized that it's also important to discuss these things. I don't want to discuss that with my work, because my work is not about that. My work is not about this argument of how it should be presented. I would like to present my work in the context that I feel comfortable with, and also in the context that I feel is not going to limit the reading of my work to where I come from. An important element for me in this equation is the audience. I don't refuse to show my work. If there is a show of contemporary Egyptian artists being curated in Egypt, I would show in it. The problem for me, or one of the main problems, is how does the audience see something like this in a completely alien context? You know, like you have a show in Switzerland or Germany or the US or anywhere that has a completely different background. How many artists can represent this place? How many artists can represent an art scene? How many artists can represent what has been happening at a certain period of time in a place, a particular place that's not the place where it's shown? There's always preconceived ideas, and there's always stereotypes, and people try to understand the work based on what they already know. I'm not willing to get into this argument with my work. This is not part of what my work is about, or why I make my work. And I don't feel also that I have to prove anything to anyone. I mean, I'm Egyptian. I'm proud of being from this place. I grew up there. My work doesn't have to prove anything or to be about something that other than what I want it to be about.
I'm curious to know how was this text, because it was published in an important art magazine. How was it received, and did anyone, a curator, for instance, react on it or published something about it?
I don't think anything was published in reaction to that, but I got into a lot of. I remember people's reactions in Cairo at that point. Not a lot, but some people, argued against this and said that this is not a good point, and if somebody's interested in the work, that's actually a good thing. A lot of those people now have changed their position. Some people believe this might not be good for their practice, but they still participate in shows like that. There's also people whose work is about where they come from, so it makes a lot of sense to show in this context, and this is something I completely understand. My main concern at that point was that really most of the shows that Egyptian artists were invited to had something to do with where they're coming from, and I was concerned that this could eventually influence the diversity of art production in a place like Egypt. Because, to put it very simply, if this is the kind of work that gets shown internationally, then maybe that's the kind of work I should be doing. A lot of people think this way. A lot has happened in the last 10 years, and people kind of formulated and articulated their practices a lot more, and I actually believe the Egyptian art scene is one of the most interesting ones I've seen because of its diversity, particularly.
There's also a curatorial discourse that is developing in the region that was maybe lacking 10 years ago.
That's true. That's true. As I said, it was a very premature moment, and not much was happening at that point. But a lot has happened since then, and people have been showing their work in different contexts based on what the work is about. So I don't think this is a very. I don't think this argument is as important now as it was 10 years ago. But at the same time, I have to state that I also don't believe that it's a wrong stance to take to try to do a show about a place. I believe people should try to do what they want, but I also have the right to have my own reaction to that. I've been in discussion with very smart curators who are curating Arab or Egyptian or any other regional shows. And they have pointed out things that I believe are very important also in this discussion, which is, if I don't show in shows like this, and if I show in a biennial, this is still part of the criteria for which artists are being shown. There's always a sort of quota for, you know, that lies in the background of the selection of artists for things. But at the same time, my point is always, as long as it's not presented to the public in this framework, as long as the public is not being told, this artist is here because he's Egyptian, he's here because, you know, this work makes sense within the framework of the curatorial concept, then I feel a lot more comfortable.
You mean that as long as it's not misleading the reading of your work, as long as the curatorial statement, let's say, is not misleading the reading of the specificity of your practice, then
as long as it's not limiting it
yeah.
to just where I come from.
We will get back to your practice because it would be interesting to expand a little bit on the material, but let me introduce Umer Butt and see where does the art market stand. If curators are very interested by artworks from the region that are dealing specifically with socio-political narrative, where does the art market stand? Umer, you founded your gallery, Grey Noise, in Lahore in 2008, and you moved it to Dubai 3 years ago. You represent artists from South Asia, Middle East, and Europe, and you are present in Liste at the moment with a booth dedicated to Lebanese artists. Although it's never written anywhere, because I have collaborated with you, I know that there is a clear vision and line for Grey Noise. Can you tell us a little bit about it and the choices of artists and art practices you make?
Well, when I thought about launching the gallery in Lahore, my biggest frustration as a Pakistani was the fact that I was trying to improve the infrastructure of a gallery, how it is supposed to be. That was the biggest lag, I thought, which I had to fill. And the concept of representation was non-existent. So 2008 was, I think, I took a brave step and I signed up some friends I knew because I was myself an artist who was not very successful commercially. So, and then my entire, I think, concept of developing Grey Noise was to look at an artist who does not specifically trying to reflect a specific geography or again the tag of Pakistan for per se. I mean, I'm pure. I was looking at pure minimalism. I was looking at people who were making work for the pure pleasure of aesthetic, and that's something which I think I started off with. And in 2012, I moved my gallery to Dubai for personal reasons, and the agenda was quite similar. In fact, expanded. I was very closely looking at Europe because of my education was in Europe. I was interacting with artists there. And then Dubai being also a very young artistic representation, I felt that I could easily be a voice which will alter that. And that's what I did. And I'm still quite naive with the Middle Eastern art practice because I've only focused on Lebanon currently, but I'm taking it zone by zone because I'm just a 6-year-old gallery. Signing up Charbel was purely on my interest in his poetry, which he reflects through his artwork, and then and also he fits into the program, and it's about really looking at the sort of looking at what we're discussing, you know, like I'm not specifically representing a voice which is very evident per se, which you see in Europe or even in the Middle East, and I'm taking risks. I think, and that's what is pleasurable for a gallerist, really.
Can you tell us a little bit about the reception of these types of work that are like more conceptually driven? How do you deal with it with collectors that have a specific expectation, if any?
I'm making collectors, really. I mean, I'm not going to say that I have a huge lineup of collectors queuing outside my gallery, you know. I'm meeting people every day. Basel being a fantastic city where I got exposed primarily to people who understand these aesthetics I'm showing. I have, I've never sold a lot of work from the region I'm from, specifically where I'm located right now in Dubai. I mean, I don't have much to do with that city, really. But I am developing that. I'm educating people by showing them practices which they usually laugh at, you know, because they don't understand what I'm showing. I mean, I've had instances, people come into my gallery and ask me, is your show up, you know? Because I'm interested in that discourse, and I teach them and I educate them, and that's my role as a gallerist, other than making making straight away money, and that also is because of my background. I've read art history, and I respect how an artist works, and that's the relationship with with a gallery is supposed to be making with an artist. I mean, it's like a family. So I'm very closely working with the artists.
Really closely work with them, and you also sometimes mediate their works, because there's a lack of critics, of people writing about art. I mean, I don't know how the situation is in Dubai, but in many places this is let's say a practice or endeavor that is taking right at the moment, and maybe a few years ago it wasn't the case. We will maybe take one question now from the audience before we ask more questions to the artist, and if you have one. Any question? Okay, so no question. I have plenty. Basim, you moved to Basel 7 years ago. Did anything changed in your practice when you moved here? And can you tell us what changed, if any?
Yeah, a lot has changed. I don't think it has a direct connection to being here in particular. I think it mostly has something to do with the passing of time and the development of my work. There were certain changes that happened because, you know, I remember the day I saw my first Super 8 camera. It was here, and now I work with film a lot. But I wouldn't say that being here influenced my work, because also being in Cairo before that, I don't believe influenced my work a lot. I was always interested in working in certain areas that are not really particular to a specific place. Actually, when I construct narratives for my films, I try to, they're fictional narratives. So they're mostly, when they're about places, they're about fictional places that don't exist. They're weaved from footage that was taken in a lot of different cities, but without, and also in my other work with photography, for example, without giving out any hints to where that place could be. So they could be anywhere. Because they're fictional narratives, it gives me a lot of freedom to maneuver within the framework of what is fiction, and then there won't be no conflict between people saying, I know this place. It doesn't make sense that he's presenting it as another place. So, yeah, of course, things have changed in the last 7 years because my work changes, like any artist. One of the most important things that kind of were important for me is being here is you're right in the center of Europe, so you're exposed to a lot of things. You can travel. I can fly anywhere in Europe in an hour and a half. This helped me to go to my openings whenever I had a show somewhere else in Europe, and it started. It creates a network. You start talking to more people. You have more interesting discussions with other people. Yeah, so it has influenced things, but not in a direct way, maybe.
And you, Pascal, you exhibit a lot as well in Europe and in international platforms. How can you tell us about the reception and the reading of your work?
Actually, it's a different practice from Bassam. I'm based in Beirut, and I do produce everything in Beirut. And I only move to intervene with my work. So there is some sort of dialogue between the work and how I'm producing it in this city. So for sure, it can sometimes condition a lot my work, because after all, I'm using the resources that are available. But I like to challenge myself always to create everything in Beirut and to be somehow rooted in my city, because I'm always reacting on the spot on whatever is happening around me.
And how do you respond to Gregory's research, for instance, on this revival of the modernist? Like, have you ever considered? Okay, interruption. We're gonna stay. Okay, so nous avons encore 15 minutes. Basim, so yeah, do you relate to the modern artists from Lebanon? Like,
not specifically, because my work reflects more the moment, because I'm more interested in where I live now. But for sure,
in terms of aesthetics, of forms, of research on
as a research and as background, it would be always refreshing to look on these past moments. But it's always for me like a reference more than working or establishing some sort of continuation on what's happened before.
Gregory, you wrote text on Pascal's practice. What do you think?
Specifically about Pascal?
About Pascal and the relationship to the modernist and this influence.
I'm going to say it in French. Il ne faut pas que ce soit tiré par les cheveux. I cannot translate this in English. I mean that Pascal is in an artistic history, but I'm not going to try to find a link between Pascal and this specific Lebanese artist from the 1960s or 70s. And perhaps if I find the link, it will be a coincidence. So I don't think we must try to establish relations everywhere. And the history is something that is much more global, and we need more time, etc. So it's not this specific work that will be related to this other artwork.
Anyone from the guest want to intervene on someone else, or do we have another question? Yes, we have a question.
Hi, my name is Madeline, and I was just wondering if you all could talk to the notion of memory and the way that memory affects reality, and how perhaps you're working, if not directly against it, rather obliquely against the dominant sort of Western memory. And I say this as an American, so there's that.
Sorry, are you addressing your question to someone specifically, or? Like how the artists on this panel address the question of memory?
I would say the artist or even the historian, because I think he might have a particular way of thinking about it, because he deals in memory and history and facts and where they get tangled.
We are talking about non-narrative practices here, but we will. If someone wants to react?
Well, I didn't hear the question very well. But I heard that there was this question of memory. And the question of memory can come when you talk about memory, specifically in Lebanon, we usually talk about memory of the war. But it can be something much more universal. And she addressed the question to the historian, but the artist is going to answer. So as an artist, I work on abandoned buildings. And so it's very much related to memory, history, war, etc. But this practice is also present in other countries. And I met 2 years ago a photographer, an American photographer, who came from Cincinnati to Beirut. He came to my place. He saw my pictures, and we discussed about memory, etc. And 2 years later, he sent me as a gift one of his pictures of abandoned houses in Cincinnati, because this guy also does pictures on this subject. And I hanged the picture in my place, and the visitors who came to my place asked me if I took the picture, and if the picture was shot in Beirut. And perhaps what I'm saying is totally out of space, but it can come back to an idea of some universality in art. And I wanted also to quote another artist who is present in this slideshow, and perhaps I should have quoted him before telling the story, but it was not expected. Hannibal Strugi is an artist whose work, this is his work, is in the vein of a history of abstract painting. And he's very influenced by Anthony Caro and other artists. And this artist has emerged in the early 1990s at the period when all these works with history, memory, identity were emerging. And this artist was extremely frustrated because he didn't find his place. This guy was one of these artists who believes in art as some universal international family in the continuity of modernism, of Fluxus, of Cobra, of Arte Povera, etc. Even if Arte Povera is Italian, it is not specifically Italian in its, when you say the work, it's not written Italy on it. Some are, Luciano Fabro's Italia d'Oro, but I'm not going to talk about Arte Povera now. So Hannibal Strugi was extremely frustrated about this fact that artworks are deeped in national identity. While this guy is, in fact, working on the idea of memory. But the work, when you see this, it doesn't really tell that it is war. It can be something else. But it's very inspired by the traces of the bullets that you can find on the buildings after the war. I don't know if I answered the question. I don't think so.
Basim, your work also conveys somehow memory. You blur the lines between real memories, fake memories, image, text, sounds. Maybe you want to say something, maybe not. But
well, I try to, in a lot of the, specifically the films or the photographic works that have a sort of sequence of images, to try to talk about things like history and the future, and how history repeats itself, and how the details that make up a memory are really a lot more important than what the memory becomes in the end. And to somehow try to focus on those details and work with sequences of events and try to analyze the absurdity that occurs when unrelated sequences of events somehow happen one after the other, and then you end up with a result, and maybe what you end up in the end with is completely unexpected with what you started with. So in my films specifically, there's always this idea of, I mean, you mentioned that they mostly don't have a beginning or an end. And this is partly because I'm very interested in this question of how history is repeated and how history is being written.
And the absurdity of that.
Yeah, and how the absurdity is forgotten, and we try to create a memory that kind of makes sense in a way.
I would like to open up to a rather philosophical question. We are trying to keep aside from the political from the very beginning. In your video, 13 essential rules for understanding the world. Flowers are given speech, and the narrator says that abstract behavior is the way of this world. Isn't this a political statement somehow?
Well, the film is full of statements. All 13 rules are statements. I don't know if it's political, but the beginning of that is I think it's either, well, yeah, I think it's never use logic. Abstract behavior is the way of this world. But it also has a lot to do with the whole structure of the film, where there is, it's very harsh and defeatist and bleak at mostly, but there's also the humor that's lurking in the background with the tulips and the faces drawn on their petals, and how that somehow you're always confronted with that. It doesn't make sense, but also you get used to it. You get comfortable with this idea at a certain point. The idea was to present these rules. I mean, that's how I mean, they're all rules that, or things that we've, at some point in our lives, most people have thought of them. I mean, there is a lot about death, a lot about the vanity of the whole thing, a lot about not trying to make a point, because in the end it doesn't matter. But there are the things that we think about, but we don't want to think about every day, so we can keep on going, and I do this also.
Is the narrator you?
It's my voice, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pascal, to what extent is your work on material and this distortion of tools and machinery read as a political act, let's say? How do you read it? Aesthetics as a political.
For sure, it has this kind of relationship, but while working or during the let's say the construction of any work, I don't focus basically about the machine or about the tool in itself. So sometimes the work will become like kind of flow of ideas, or it might shift to something else. But basically, for sure, it comes with this tiny statement, and then I start playing with the tool or the material in itself. But basically, I can mention a few titles, because always the relationship between the title and the work can create some sort of strong relationship. For instance, like blue collar, white collar, the tie line, I race you, emptiness. So all these titles somehow they are connected to my city, but somehow they are like a need. So yeah, somehow.
Question from the audience? No. Umer? You visited Pascal, and you know very much about Bassim's work. How can you read it? What can you say about it? And do you relate to these type of practices, and why?
Well, visiting first Pascal's studio this year with you was of course another sort of trajectory which I'm trying to explore, really to build up a conversation. And I think my first visit to Beirut was based around conversations. It was nothing to do with really how a gallerist usually goes to a studio and then, you know, comes back with an exhibition. So I wanted to talk, and I think that exchange of conversation was important. So I met a writer, I met various people who basically kind of showed me the region and made my understanding open up. I don't think I'm much willing to comment about their practices because I do not know the depth of it, but on the surface what I saw at Pascal's studio was something again which is unusual, you know, like there is this preconceived notion around an artist from, let's say, in his case, Beirut, who's practicing, you know. I mean, you can see the images. They're about an object. They can be read in various ways, and I think that is the beauty of his work, that there are multiple narratives one can really extract off each piece. And what I loved about his studio was that it is probably one of the most beautiful places where one can think and make art. And that is very rare. And you see that in his work. You see that discipline which he has in his premise, which you just enter the place. And I think these things we miss. You know, I miss this in Dubai. We don't have artists living in Dubai. And I had seen Bassim's video in the Istanbul Biennale. In fact, again, we were together. And you know, the same narrative. I mean, you really read his work in various means. I mean, there's humor. It also irritated me a lot because it was about that. What exactly is this you're looking at? At the same time, there was poetry, which was beautiful. The text which he's narrating is more to do with the poetics of constructing a language which is unique to him. And I think that is something which I admire, and I really try to project through the gallery, what I'm showing.
Exploring the poetics.
Yeah, exactly, totally. Let's go.
So I was said that we still have 5 minutes to go. I would really like to open the floor for questions. Okay, we will continue. Gregory, the book, War and Other Impossible Impossibilities, has a particular story. Maybe you don't want to go into the details, but can you tell us a little bit the politics behind that experience?
The book was commissioned, as I said, in 2010. And while it was in progress, history was completely evolving with what started in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, etc. And then the book was released in 2012, so 2 years later. The situation in 2012 was completely different of the situation in 2010. And when the book was released, the collector who commissioned the book didn't want it anymore. So the book was released, but it was never distributed. And this is a very kind of surrealistic situation, because before the collector informed us he didn't want to distribute the book, we had sent the book to the media. So the book has reviews in the press. So if you Google the book, you find the reviews on online media, but you don't find a place where you can buy it. And I think this, the story of the book is part of history. When it happened, it was extremely frustrating to see the result of 2 years of work going to the garbage. And then it was an extremely interesting lesson, because you think about while the book was being done in 2011, there was the Venice Biennale. And on the cover of the French newspaper Le Monde, there was a painting of the Lebanese painter Ayman Baalbaki, who is known for works depicting warriors with a keffiyeh. And this painting was on the cover of the newspaper, and it was written, so on the front page, it was written, Révolution arabe, l'intuition des artistes. Arab Revolution, the artists intuitions, thank you. And while it was absurd because the artwork was done much earlier than the Arab Revolution and didn't have anything to do with the Arab Revolutions. And this artwork, one of these artworks in the book, and this is the kind of artworks that is in the book, and that was perhaps rejected by the collector. So it's very interesting to see how the art is may evolve and how our perception of art may evolve in this context that is extremely unstable, extremely, there is this term I like in English, unrest. Unrest in the Middle East, and the Middle East is always in unrest, as I said. So this is the story of the book, and we have a gong.
We can continue. In the book, I remember Gregory.
A second gong.
Okay. Just a last comment. As an art historian, I remember in the book you were really analyzing also formally many artworks of this collection. So
yes.
maybe
and artworks that are not in the collection.
And artworks that are not in the collection. So also, I mean, there was included in the book what
yes.
we are calling today as non-narrative artworks. So what is the role of the art historian then? You know, like analyzing formally artworks and including them in the narrative. And for instance, here you did it somehow in the book for certain artists. Like,
well, as you said, the role of the art historian is to analyze and to try to put things in context. Well, now I'll see if I have another book to do about narrative or non-narrative. It will be a completely new and fresh, but I don't say the book is obsolete. I say that the book is in history. It is in, I mean that the period in which this book was done, it's not so far, but it is far. And it's difficult to be an art historian in these conditions. It's perhaps more easy to talk about Michelangelo.
True. I think that we have to stop here unless we have a question from the audience, a last one. Okay, I'm sorry, we have to stop. Thank you very much. And we can, of course, continue the discussion informally outside. Thank you. Good night.